Hello, just so you know, I'm sorry, I woke people up. I checked with Patrick. Apparently, there's an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting earlier in the morning, and they turned down the thermostat because they like it cool in here. And so I noticed when I came in, it was very low. So I talked to him. He said he turned it on a half hour ago again to bring up the temperature. So it's gone up 1 degree since I went to talk to him. So it may be a little while before we don't have to wear our overcoats, okay? Oh, hello. Just to have your attention again, Susie and I want to make sure that our folks who are streaming hear all the comments and questions. So I'm going to leave the microphone up here. So if you want to make a comment or ask a question, we're asking you to speak into the microphone so that our folks who are in the internet there can hear us, because even I have trouble sometimes hearing people when I sit up here. So if it isn't too much of a bother, if you could do that. Thank you.
Good morning. So is Seth your nephew? Grandson. So you were just telling me that her grandson, who's a very talented cantor, I went to school. He was several years after me at rabbinical school and cantorial school. Is now studying to become a rabbi, which is great. Wonderful, wonderful news. And as you may or may not know, in this country, there are fewer jobs for rabbis by far than there are rabbis who get ordained. So the rabbis who get ordained look for work, and if you're lucky, you find a place. And if you're not so lucky, you have to try to figure out what to do in another area, teach or whatever. And so the move now has been very strongly towards rabbis studying to be cantors and cantors studying to be rabbis. When I was ordained in 2007, there were about 25 of us in the whole of the United States who had dual ordination as both rabbi and cantor, and now much, much skyrocketing, especially about cantors who want to become rabbis as well, because most congregations cannot afford two clergy. Unless it's a big, prosperous congregation, they cannot afford two clergy. And so all the calls now, if I am privy to seeing, who's hiring and who wants what, they're always for a rabbi who is musical, or mostly a rabbi who is musical. And that's because given the choice between a rabbi and a cantor, a congregation will hire a rabbi, even though Our tradition says if you have a choice between a rabbi and a cantor, you hire a cantor. You don't hire the rabbi, you hire the cantor. Why? Because the cantor leads the service. Our services are led cantorially. Saturday morning for me is 2 hours of chanting in Hebrew, which 90% of rabbis can't do. They have no idea about trope or anyway. So the trend now is very strongly towards rabbis who can sing, or, chazanim who train to become rabbis so that they can go to a congregation. Yes? So there were two sisters here who went to theological theological seminary and trained as cantors.
So they could teach.
Marketable, sure. They got their degree in cantorial, and they got a second degree in education so that they could teach. And they were one of very few in that class who got full-time jobs. Yes? So Seth, her grandson, is going to be at Ramat Zion on the 22nd. They're having a cantorial concert. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So I'll just finish with this and then get on with our work for today. This is exactly what happened when I took over at Valley Beth Israel 22 years ago. I had followed a cantor there, and we had a rabbi and a cantor, and it had been that way for many years. And they were, the rabbi retired, and the cantor was moving to a different congregation. So the cantor called me and said, Mark, they've been interviewing forever and ever for a new cantor. They can't find anybody. Go sing for them. They'll love you. So I went in, I sang the service, and they offered me the job on the spot that day. And then we were coming up to high holidays, and they just weren't happy with the interim rabbi that they had after the rabbi had the old rabbi had left the synagogue. Rabbi Rubenstein, who was a real mensch and a real scholar, wonderful man. But he retired. He very, very smart, very good man. And they hired somebody else, and they weren't crazy about him. And so they started looking for another rabbi, and they could not find anybody that fit, that they liked. So I got a lot of chutzpah up, and I went into the board meeting, and I said to everybody, look, you guys can't afford 2 clergy anymore. Those days are over, as with most synagogues. You already like me as cantor. Send me to rabbinical school, and I will commit to you in a long-term contract as both rabbi and cantor. And by the way, this is how much money you'll save if you do that. And they looked at me and said, yes. and the rest is history. Okay. So today we are going to Brazil. Has anybody been to Brazil? Oh, tell us about your travels, and we'll go around the room and tell us. Oh, how do it doesn't really, yeah, you have to, I don't think maybe this one, that one might, yes. Yes, great, just,
Who's been to Brazil? Who's been to Brazil? You want to talk about it? it's okay. I don't think much has changed.
I remember much more about Chile in Argentina than I do about Brazil, because it's been so long. But Mike said we were at a small synagogue there. I can't remember anything.
Rio, or was that Santos, or Recife? No, it would be in Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo?
No, we didn't go to Sao Paulo.
It was in Rio.
Was it a Rio?
No,
Here, you talk, please.
that's all
I can't remember.
that's all there was a little synagogue guy with a kippah, and he showed us
I think
around.
Joette wants to talk. Okay. All right, Joette wants to say something about Brazil. Joette's been all over the world.
So I was in Brazil briefly. It was a port on one of the port stops on a cruise I was on. And we went to a small beach town first, which has a lovely statue of Brigitte Bardot sitting on a bench because she liked to vacation there. So they put a statue of Brigitte Bardot. I forgot the name of the town. It wasn't very far from Rio. Then I went to Rio for Carnival, and it was kind of crazy there. At Carnival, they have a huge parade route for there's, I think, 2 nights of official Carnival, which is Mardi Gras type thing, parade. So I went to it, and what they have, it's a street, and basically they have bleachers on both sides of the street, so the parade comes down the street, and they have every samba club in Rio or in the country that wants to participate or is chosen to participate. I don't know how it goes. Each one has a float and dancers and costumes and music, and so each one goes down. It starts like at about 9 o'clock at night, and it goes until approximately 6 o'clock in the morning, and with all of them. I was not there that long, but since I was with a group, and they took us from the ship to the location of the parade, and as we entered, they said, it's going to go all night long. You can come back to the ship anytime you want. However, do not leave the stadium by yourself. We will be standing here, and we want you to come and find us. When you're ready to leave, we will get you on the bus and take you back to the ship. Do not leave the stadium by yourself. Do not leave the stadium. It was made very clear to us because it is kind of dangerous in the streets. However, at the parade, it was just absolutely incredible, really incredible. The music, the dancing, it was really quite wonderful. And I have to say, it was, they have lovely, lovely beaches there, and everything you hear about their style of beach attire is true. Yeah, and I have to say they did one thing very, very smart, because the sand gets very hot, and to get from the sidewalk, you have to walk on the sand to get to the water. They have pipes, tubes along the sand, sprinkling water on the sand to cool the sand off so you don't burn your feet when you're walking.
Great.
Yeah, so it was a lovely place. I was only there for a very short time, and I did not have any kind of Jewish tour there, unfortunately.
Okay.
So.
Great.
Thank you. Anybody else?
You what? You went up to see Christ the Redeemer, the very famous statue at the top.
And that's in Rio. That's in Rio.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's a beautiful I mean, it's a gorgeous thing. Okay, very good. So as Joette pointed out, many of you know in modern day Brazil for sure, you have very wealthy and you have very, very, very poor in what are called the favelas. Yes, very good. Yes, and there is a great deal of thieving and violence and drugs. Yeah, street crime. Yeah, it's quite bad. Okay, so yes, Gary. Referring to last week when we talked about Bolivia. Yes. Yes. You talked to Manny, whom Joette referred to the other week.
And anyway, he said his family came from, huh? Okay, he said his family came from Poland, and it came in the 1920s. And the other interesting thing he said there are very, very few Jews there today, and he said they can't even get a minyan.
That's terrible. Yeah.
Bocabamba?
Yeah.
Cochabamba.
Very good. So, so our story for Brazil starts in the 16th century, meaning the 1500s, and that should be no surprise to anyone because at the time, Brazil was a Portuguese colony. Brazil is the largest country in South America by far. If you look at a map of South America, it's Brazil. There's a whole lot of Brazil there. Yeah, 50%. Yeah, it's huge. And it becomes a haven for Sephardic Jews, as you might guess, after the Portuguese Inquisition. So we know that the Spanish Inquisition comes to Spain in what year? 1492. Very good. The Portuguese Inquisition comes a few years later, in the 1500s, to Portugal. And because Brazil was a Portuguese colony, then Brazil exports the Inquisition to Brazil. And the first Jews who come over, there were about 1,500 of them. They were, as you might expect, conversos, fleeing persecution from the Inquisition. And they went to Recife, which you see on the map here, northeast Brazil. At the time, Recife was a Dutch colony. So, the entire country of Brazil was a Portuguese colony, but there were little pockets, and especially Recife, that the Dutch had controlled. And of course, the Dutch were very sympathetic to Jews. The Portuguese, because of the Inquisition, not so much. And we have the first synagogue in the Americas that emerges in Recife, and it's called Kahal Tzur Yisrael. Tzur Yisrael, the Rock of Israel. You know on Saturday morning, Tzur Yisrael, Kuma Bezrat Yisrael, Ufdechinu Mecha Yehuda V'Yisrael. Okay. And that is established in 1636. And as I said, there were about 1,500 Jews, and that colony in Recife and that synagogue had about 1,450 members. Yeah, so it was good. And of course, these were Sephardic Jews. They were conversos fleeing the Portuguese Inquisition. In 1654, In 1536, in 1536, the Inquisition, as we said, moved from Portugal to Brazil. And of course, that puts many Jews in danger, and who had settled in Portuguese territory. So those Jews left regular Portuguese territory and went to Recife in 1654, because the Dutch were in control of Recife in 1654. The other Jews were expelled from Brazilian territory. So there was only that northeastern Dutch colony that would welcome Jews at the time. Many Jews worked for this will not surprise you, the Dutch West India Company, right? We know that. And they worked in sugar production in northeastern Brazil. When we get to the 18th century, which is the 1700s, of course, some Jews began to move to southeastern Brazil to work in the gold mines. But some of them were arrested for being Jewish. And what's very interesting is that Brazilian families that descend from these conversos lived in basically 4 cities: Minas Gerais, Rio de Janeiro, Pará, and Bahia. Pará and Bahia are areas you'll see there, but all pretty much in northeastern Brazil. In 1822, we had an influx of Moroccan Jews to Belém, which is in the area of Pará that you see there. So you had Sephardic, and as we now call them, Mizrahi Jews, coming to the northeastern area. In 1824, we have the first synagogue in Pará, in the city of Belém, called Sha'ar Hashamayim. Sha'ar Hashamayim. Sha'ar, gates, Hashamayim, of the heavens. Gates of the heavens. By 1904, there is the Jewish Colonization Association, and they are settling Russian Jews in Rio Grande do Sul, which is at the bottom. It's the southernmost area of Brazil. So that should not be surprising to us. So 1904, Russian Jews. Why Russian Jews in 1904? Very good. They were escaping the pogroms. Pogroms starting in 1881 with the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. Blamed on Jews, even though Jews were not responsible for it. And so that is the first waves, starting in 1881, of immigration to get out of Russia. We see many waves of aliyot to Israel at that time, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, to Palestine at that time. And yes? Was that the first Aliyah? Yes. Yes. So Zisel asked, was that the first Aliyah? Following the 1881 assassination, yes. That was the first Aliyah. And as you may recall, successive waves of certainly Eastern European and Russian Jews. It started out with Russian Jews, then it spread to Eastern European Jews in the successive Aliyot. And the problem became that at the time, Jerusalem was under control of of Islam. Yes, absolutely. And so it had a majority population by far of Muslims. There were a small group, a small contingent of Jews in Jerusalem who were mostly scholars and studying our texts, but they were very, very small. And as long as they were very, very small, the Muslim population didn't have a problem. It was fine. It is Ziesel's perception that there were always Jews in Jerusalem.
Very, very minority, very, very small, but still a Kehillah.
Very small minority, but still a little community. And that's exactly true. Absolutely true. There has always been a Jewish presence in Jerusalem, however small at that time. And it is only because of the successive waves of aliyot, of Russian and Eastern European Jews, that it becomes a problem for Muslims. Because these Jews were coming saying, we're going to rebuild our land. We're going to make everything beautiful again. Because what was Palestine at that time? Certainly southern Palestine. Rocks, swamps, mosquitoes. It was horrible. Desert. And so you can see the Muslims are looking at these people. What, you're going to resettle your land? No, that's not going to happen. It's our land. Thank you very much. And each successive wave came in to work the land and build up the Jewish homeland and blah, 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 blah. Well, that wasn't a problem until the immigration threatened to throw off the balance from a minority population to a majority population. And that's when all hell broke loose. When it looked like there were going to be more Jews than Muslims, then everything was a problem. And absolutely. And that is still a problem today in reverse, right? Because in Jerusalem you have Muslim families, they happen to be Arab Muslim families, that are having many children. And so the population balance is becoming a problem, because if you allow them to be citizens and you allow them to vote, sooner or later they're going to vote the Jews out and their own anyway. And Israel was founded as a Jewish state. Okay. So we have the Jewish Colonization Association, and they begin to resettle Russian Jews in 1904. The first attempts at establishing communities for these Russian Jews failed. They tried to set up settlements, and it didn't work. And it didn't work out because there was a lack of infrastructure at the time. There were no administrative offices that could handle the resettlement. There were lack of facilities where the agriculture could happen. And most notably, the Jews had a preference for city jobs rather than working the fields in the agricultural jobs. And so the first attempts failed. By 1920, the Jewish Colonization Association had bought land in the South and started selling it to non-Jews. And that improved the image among many Brazilians of Jews not being very productive workers. Why? Because Jews like to be involved with finance and commerce. That was the strong suit. And didn't want to be involved in something that was labor intensive. Therefore, they were looked upon as not very productive. They just want to go and have the cushy jobs in the city. They don't want to work. And ultimately, the idea that Jewish organizations were selling land to non-Jews gave rise to the removal of restrictions on immigration to Brazil for Jews. By World War I, there were 7,000 Jews in Brazil. So that was pretty good. World War I, dates on World War I? Good. 1914, 1915, 1918. Very good. So just for us to have a sense of what we're talking about, the early 1900s. There were 7,000 Jews. By 1910, so this is during World War I, there was a Jewish school that opened in Paulo Alegre, which was the capital of Rio Grande del Sul at the bottom there. By 1915, there was a Yiddish newspaper. So we had many Jews concentrated in Recife, but then we also had a nice congregation, nice population, a nice community that was centered in the very, 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 very south. The ones in Recife, mostly Sephardic. The ones in the south, mostly Ashkenazic. In 1916, the community in Rio de Janeiro forms an aid committee for World War I victims. And by 1941, the Israel Religious Association, which is now a member of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, begins. So it seems, and I tried to find the Israel Religious Association, what it seems like is that something along the lines of more progressive Judaism begins to have a hold, begins to take place in the southern area. So, as you all know, maybe the movements of Judaism are very much a modern phenomenon, and up until the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was just Judaism. And we can say it resembles mostly Orthodoxy, if we're going to try to put a label to it today. But there was only Orthodoxy. And then comes in the United States, then comes the Reform movement. And the Reform movement basically says, you guys are way too, you've misinterpreted a lot, and it doesn't make sense for us today. This began in Germany, and it doesn't make sense for us today. You need to remove these restrictions on clothing, remove these restrictions on eating, and because all it does is separate us. And the longer we stay separate, we'll never get the right to vote. We'll never get the right to own property, because all of the rest of German society thinks of us as the other, and they don't like us. And so in order for us to integrate into society and be able to get civil rights, we need to relax some of these restrictions. So the first idea within Reform Judaism was a movement to gain civil rights in Europe, which Jews were prevented from having. So the Reform movement comes out of a response to that. And as we know, basically what the Reform movement has said is that the ritual halakha is not applicable. All the ethical halakha is. Ethical halakha meaning you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not commit adultery. These are ethical. Yes? My parents belonged to Leo Beck, and I went to religious school there.
So, As I recall, our 5th grade religious school class was totally about ethics. And a lot of the focus for the congregation was about social action. It was very political. And the rabbis were, well, when I was little, we only had one rabbi. Excuse me. But eventually we had 2 rabbis. But so that was my focus, and that's what I associated Judaism with growing up.
Sure. So I'll give you just a 2-minute primer or so on how this relates to us, then we'll get back to Brazil, is that the reform movement was founded on a principle called ethical monotheism. In other words, the reformers said, okay, how do we change Judaism so that we can fit in? What's the essence of Judaism? And they said the essence of Judaism is ethical monotheism, following what the prophets have told us. We believe in one God who asks us to be good people in the world. Okay, that sounds pretty great to all of us. On the one hand, it's like, well, yes, for sure, okay. On the other hand, what is the essence of Christianity? What is the essence of mainstream Islam? Okay, you see the sort of the problem. All the world's major religions teach kindness, caring, being a good person in the world, believing in God. Okay, so what separates us from anybody else? Well, certainly our concept of God separates us. Our concept of God is very different from Christian concept of God, and a little bit different from the Muslim concept of God. But also then it's in how we practice, how we worship, how we practice. So it would not surprise me that all of your lectures would have been on ethics, because that's the primary concern of Reform Judaism. All right. So having said that, the Reform movement comes along and does that. Regular Judaism, Orthodoxy, responds and says, you guys threw out too much. No, thank you very much. Maybe we have to make a few changes, but what you did was way too far. Out of that emerges modern, what the equivalent of what we have as modern Orthodoxy. And then, of course, comes along the conservative movement in Europe, which started out as positive historical Judaism, and then when it gets exported to the United States, it becomes conservative Judaism, and they tried to find something that didn't throw away so much on the left and didn't keep so much on the right. Tried to balance it, and it's a very tricky balancing act. The more modern that times begin. So we have this Israel Religious Association, and it seems to have been the first attempt at some kind of progressive Judaism, at modernization in Brazil. So starting in 1926, there is a large group of Jews who begin to immigrate to Brazil from Europe, obviously. And that only increases once the Nazi Party becomes very prominent in 1933. So from 1933 to 1945, as we have seen with all the other countries that we've talked about, Brazil blocks the doors to Jewish refugees. And there were more than 16,000 visas that were denied to Jews during that time who were trying to flee the Holocaust. Now, what we found, a lot of the anti-Semitism at the time was based on the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Can someone tell me about that?
Classic anti-Semitic story with a bunch of lies about human sacrifices and all the terrible things that Jews do.
Good. Classic anti-Semitic story about the terrible things that Jews do. Yes, basically it was written in 1903 in Russia, and the large theme of it is that the Jews are trying to take over the world, and Jews are bad. It was a big hoax, but it caught on very prominently in many, many places. For those of you who know our history here, Henry Ford, who started Ford Motor Company, virulent anti-Semite, and based a lot of his views on the protocols of the Elders of Zion. As far as I know, yes. Did he also assist in getting it published here in the United States? I believe so. But he certainly promulgated it once it was here. What's nice to know now is that between the years 2013 and 2014, they took a look at how many anti-Semitic events happened in Brazil. And it turns out that it's very low. It had one of the lowest anti-Semitic index ratings at 16%. That they obviously they rated it from 0 to 100%, 100% being the worst, 0 being the best. So a very low rate of 16% in terms of overall how many anti-Semitic events occurred. And that's really good news for Brazil. In Latin America, it is by far the lowest number of anti-Semitic incidents. And in the world, it's only behind Canada, which has a rate of 14%, and the US, which has a rate of 9%. Now, I expect in this last year, our rate probably has gone up. This information doesn't include this last year. As we all know, anti-Semitism in the US is now, again, a real problem.
Just as a point of information, in Cuba, anti-Semitism was practically zero.
In Cuba, anti-Semitism was practically zero.
There were some, but by far, very, very.
But under Castro, religion itself wasn't.
Castro was never an anti-Semite.
Okay.
In fact,
Castro was never an anti-Semite.
one of his ministers was a Jewish kid.
One of his ministers was Jewish.
I mean, but I sort of knew it because the age difference. Castro was terrible, but never an anti-Semite.
Never an anti-Semite. But what about religion in general in Cuba? Tolerated but not encouraged. So I think that's one reason why there might not be so much anti-Semitism, is that religion in general was very much downplayed.
As a point of information, trivial so to speak, Castro was invited once to a Hanukkah celebration. In the
Castro was invited once to a Hanukkah celebration.
a Hanukkah celebration in Cuba after he took over. He was asked, well, what's Hanukkah? And the president of the Jewish congregation in Havana, being a very smart lady, she says, well, that talks about the revolution of the Jews. And Castro said, revolution, I like that. He came, he was always terribly late to everything. So he came late, as usual, nothing unusual for that, made one of his very long speeches, and in the middle of the speeches, he made the following statement. The Torah is the greatest social document ever. That's what
We
Castro
like that.
That's
Good.
what Castro said to the Jewish community. So Castro was a terrible dictator, but not anti-Semitic.
Very good. Thank you for that, Cecil. Okay, so let's wrap up. In terms of the world, Jewish communities, Brazil is 10th. Well, that would be surprising and not surprising. Surprising because it's in Latin America, not surprising because Brazil is huge. So, and it has been for a long time a safe haven for Jews.
I have a question. When the Jews came to Brazil, and in the early 1900s, I believe the rubber industry started becoming huge in Brazil.
Were Jews involved in that industry?
Jews involved in the rubber industry.
You know what? I'll have to go back and look a little more. But in the research that I did in preparing for today, I didn't see anything about Jews being involved in the rubber industry. Nothing stood out like that. I'll see if I can. When I go back, I'll see if I can look that up a little bit. So Brazil has the 10th largest Jewish community in the world right now. By one estimate, it was about 107,000, another 120,000, but it's a substantial community. Half of those Jews live in Sao Paulo, which, as Gary said, is a huge Jewish population. A quarter of those Jews live in Rio de Janeiro, and then the last quarter live in various smaller communities. And they are pretty much equally distributed between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, which I think is very interesting because in many places we have either larger Ashkenazi and smaller Sephardic or the other way around. But in Brazil, it seems to be pretty much even. Jews are involved in all facets of life in Brazil: politics, sports, academia, trade, industry, everywhere. Not surprising, the biggest problem that the Jewish community faces in Brazil right now, according to them, is intermarriage. Yes. And between 1948 and 2021, there were about 16,000 Brazilian Jews who made Aliyah to Israel. So, who left Brazil to go to Israel? Yes.
It seems almost not, come on, Cecil.
It's okay. Counterintuitive.
It seems counterintuitive that when, historically speaking, when Jews were oppressed, the community was the strongest. However, as we have here in the United States, which is not a historical oddity at all, when Jews have had freedom
Prosperity.
like we have here, the greatest problem has been the
Intermarriage.
well, yeah, but yes, the intermarriage, but also the dissolution of the communal spirit in
of the
Judaism.
community. Sure. So I don't think this makes. I think this makes perfect sense. When you have a situation where Jews are in desperate times, they band together very quickly, and they realize in order for self-preservation, we have to stick together and we have to be cohesive as a community. However, as Cecil points out, when Jews are in times of prosperity, in places where it's very easy to be lax and not worry about your Judaism, that people become lax and they don't worry about their Judaism. On the other hand, the world is so much smaller now. And it's, when you go out, our children, our grandchildren meet people, many, most of them are not Jewish. So is it not surprising that someone would find a partner, a girlfriend, a boyfriend, who's not Jewish? I mean, it's just, it's inevitable, basically, because everywhere you go. And so the best situation is if that Jewish partner, and it obviously is if we have either if we have a male who marries a non-Jew, or we have a female Jew who marries a non-Jew and then decides not to raise the children Jewish. The best situation is in both of those cases is, okay, look, we have a mixed marriage, but we both decided we want the children to be Jewish and they're going to be raised Jewish. And so that's the best situation for the continuation of our people. But you can't decide whom you fall in love with. It just sort of happens.
Speaking of Brazil,
Yes.
I have a question about what was the attitude of Brazil in welcoming Nazis or former Nazis?
I think during the war years, as in many South American countries, Brazil was how do I say this? Yes, it was, because it had closed the door to immigration for Jews. Brazil was open to having Nazis come in. They found even more of a haven in Argentina, as we know.
Yeah.
But Brazil, certainly, among all Latin countries, was as well.
And afterwards, there were the Peronistas, Juan Perón and Eva Perón and the whole clan, and they were very pro-Nazi.
Yeah.
Very fascist.
Yes.
That's why I have a trouble ever seeing the play Eva. Because
Sure. And so, like you said, I mean, most Latin American countries were fascist, and they closed their immigration offices off to Jews, and they were either sympathetic to, or they didn't not support Nazi Germany. All right, I've gone over, so next week we will venture more into the bees.
Where other countries?
Huh?
The other bees.
More bees. Yes.
Okay.
Have a beautiful week, everyone. Stay dry as you can. All right.
All right, Rabbi, thank you so much. And you have a good week, too.
next week from Atlanta, we're going to visit our daughter and our family.
So we'll be streaming you.
Great. We'll have a safe trip.
Yeah, we will.
Lives in Utah. St. George. There is a Chabad there, and there is a Reformed congregation. Of course, most of the people in the Reformed congregation are retirees who've moved to St. George. So I said, well, I'm sure they all have granddaughters. Why don't you go and meet them? Because he's a very cute guy, but his girlfriend is like, her family was Mormon, and she's not practicing. But, what am I going to do? He lives in Utah.
That's all you can do. Encourage, and that's it.
Yeah. So.
But because at some point, I think, if you push, he will resent you.
Of course. Well, he's not interested in religion. He doesn't like religion at all. But
So I think the biggest thing is that you hope he finds someone who loves him to death and who's going to make him very happy.
yes. So he did when he moved there, and he bought a house. The housewarming gift he wanted from us was a mezuzah. So it was like a step in the right direction for Henry.
We are all facing, all of us are facing this.
My daughter, who's very Jewish, very identified, and she went to New Community Jewish College, high school, and all that stuff. But she went to adopt for elementary school, so she really got a good Jewish education. She just doesn't do anything. I mean, she celebrates holidays with my cousin.
Does she have children?
No, and I think she's not going to, because she's 29 now and she's not with anybody, so. You never know. Well, also she's got health issues that would prevent, make the pregnancy difficult. So, but maybe, if she had a partner then.
We are all in this position with our children and our grandchildren.
And on the other hand, people shouldn't be having lots of kids because the world is overpopulated. You need to have some, but I'm saying, it's like, I was watching CBS Sunday Morning, and they had a guy on who had predicted that the world population was going to destroy the planet, and that's what's happening. So.
I had asked about whether or not that Brazil is Venezuela had seen things for decades. And I wasn't sure if there were, I mean, I know in Argentina there was a huge German Nazi enclave, but I wasn't sure if Mengele found himself in that or he just kind of.
I'll do a little more research on this.
I have my cousin is a cantor, and he was a cantor and I guess rabbi in Curacao. So I don't know if when you get to that country, are you going to do Curacao because it's the oldest continually used synagogue. So I'll call him and see if he wants to log in and contribute. He lives back east. And he also, before that, for 10 years, he was a cantor at a congregation in Amsterdam.
You know what? Maybe what you could do is, if you get him on the phone, I'll put the phone up to the microphone, and he can talk to the class.
Okay.
That way, that'd be fantastic. Yes, first-hand stuff is way better than. Yeah, that's great.
Chaplains in the military are all told. They have to, whether they have a good voice or not.
But also single rabbis of a synagogue. Single meaning there's only one rabbi of a small synagogue have to be called those too. And that's what started me way back because I was going to a synagogue, the rabbi by himself, and he led all the singing, and it was not really pretty. And so I went up to him one day and said, "Look, let's sing. I help you." And he said, "Yes. And so I started leading. I had no idea what I was doing. I was using the melodies. I was doing everything wrong. But
Did a little of that also. In the military, they are the rabbi, the cantor, and the education director, and
we started our class today. We started talking because her grandson, who is a very good cantor, started studying to become a rabbi, and I was talking about the idea that only large synagogues can afford 2 clergymen now, and rabbis who can sing or cantors who have rabbinic knowledge are, yes, absolutely. When I was ordained, I had dual ordination in 2007. There were only about 25 of us in the United States. Now it's way bigger because everybody realizes there are so few rabbi jobs, and if you're going to be in a smaller congregation, this is the only way you can make it. Hey, JR. Yes, ma'am. great class.
Good to see you. So we'd like to start in just a minute or so. So if everyone could grab their coffee or tea and start making their way.
I think it has to go the other way, Sissel. I think it has to go the other way. That's this one here, in order to get it around the room. I think.
Yes, she has more room now. That it doesn't
Oh,
touch.
it'll go through.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
That's why I did it.
Remember to-
Okay, thank you.
Do you want me to help pay some out? Okay. You're a man of many talents.
My pleasure. You're staying, right? Joette's staying? Of course. Good, okay.
Thank you, thank you.
My reason for coming. Okay, fair enough.
Who else needs, Esther, did you get one?
Yes, I did.
You did?
I have one.
Did anyone not get, does anyone need a source?
Hi, Ray. It's so great to see you.
Joette, can I put
I
you,
already did it. We already talked about it.
okay. Oh, do you need a source? Joette, if anyone comes in, can I give you X?
year, so he's just finished his first semester. He's going into it starting in February, his second semester starts. Very good. Yeah. Yeah, he sees the writing on the wall.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. I want to share this morning a story that well, let me start before I go into the story. Quite frankly, studying it made me uncomfortable. Not because of any like illicit, I brought some fun stories that have scandal and sex and, and this one, that doesn't make me, that doesn't kind of get to me. But this story got to me because it's a discussion about leadership and it's a discussion about the role of government and the interaction of various, dare I say, branches of government with one another. And because that is something that is so prominently playing out today, as our legislative, judicial, executive, it's also playing out very strongly in Israel, where Prime Minister Netanyahu is under indictment, and so all of this kind of figures very prominently. What I want to do is I don't want to turn this into CNN or Fox News, okay? Everyone here has an opinion on what the Justice Department should do and or not do, and that's great. I don't want to start getting into that. I want to acknowledge that this source lends itself to a discussion on how government should work within and the various sort of powers, but I don't want it to become about advocacy for a particular political outcome or judicial outcome. Okay, but let's try and talk about that. I think we can actually have a more meaningful discussion by talking about the issues without it being particular to the news that we're experiencing today, right? In some ways, I think that'll actually be more informative because it'll be less charged for us. But I think to sort of say, wait a second, this does kind of raise a contemporary issue, I think we should just acknowledge that. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point that I wanted to make this morning is that the text that we're reading dovetails with a text that I brought last year. How many of you participated in an MID last year? Oh, a good amount of you. So a good, more than half. So it's good that there's a lot of new members as well. And online, raise your hand at home. Put your hand down. Okay. So acknowledging that some of you are familiar. So there was a text that I brought last year, which I'm not going to quiz anybody on or have any expectation of any memory. But one point last year, we were studying Pirkei Avot, which is from the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the earliest compilation of rabbinic teachings. And they're terse, they're to the point. And then there's they springboard into the Gemara, which is like a meandering phone call. You get on the phone with your friend and you start talking, you chat. Then you don't really finish one subject and you're on to something else. And then you kind of circle back. And then you make reference to an old conversation, or you even talk about people. That's the Gemara, in essence. The Mishnah plus the Gemara is the Talmud. Mishnah plus the Gemara is the Talmud. So that's this. Well, this is one volume. Now, in Pirkei Avot is unlike other Mishnah in that Pirkei Avot does not have an accompanying Gemara. So it is terse rabbinic comments without the long meandering conversation that is sprung from it. Largely because Pirkei Avot is unlike the other aspects of the Mishnah in that Pirkei Avot is sort of like ethical teachings or like good advice, sageful, wise, pithy sayings, but it's not halachic in nature, meaning it doesn't try and have like a behavioral outcome, as opposed to most other Mishnah where they're trying to communicate law. Okay, is that okay? Now, in the Pirkei Avot that we studied, we learned about this guy named Shimon ben Shetach. Does anyone name sound familiar? Shimon ben Shetach? Okay, there's like there's a street named after him in Jerusalem. He was one of he's sort of like a pre-rabbinic figure. He is before the destruction of the second temple. So he's in between Alexander the Great and the destruction of the second temple, which is at the hands of the Romans. So like Alexander the Great's like 3 something BCE, and then after Alexander the Great, there are the Maccabees. Right, I'm just giving you broad historical strokes. If we're trying to kind of like Alexander the Great, the Greeks come. Then there are the Maccabees who rebel against the Greek rule. Then they get rid of them. They establish the Hasmonean dynasty, and then the Romans come take over, and then eventually the Romans destroy the second temple. So we're in between Alexander and the Romans, the destruction at the hands of the Romans, while the Greeks are still, while the Hasmoneans, the decline of the Greek influence allows Israel's kings to kind of like, it's before the Herods. So that's when the Romans installed puppet government. So it's like we're autonomous, but it's not easy. Because what did the Maccabees, let me ground us here. What did the Maccabees do after they got rid of the Assyrian Greeks? Right. Well, first they made themselves they took over the priesthood. And they probably shouldn't have done that because they weren't from the line of the high priests. But then not only did they take over the priesthood, they also then took over the monarchy, which they shouldn't have done because they weren't from the line of David. So already there's an air of illegitimacy to their power. Not only that, you compound it. So the Maccabees, their freedom, it's like the South American or Central American story. Today's freedom fighter is tomorrow's tyrant, right? So basically what happens is the Maccabees follow that same sort of like trajectory where they toss out the Greeks, but then they become kind of influenced, and the power grab that they were rebelling against, all the virtues that they were rebelling against becomes exactly who they become. Yeah, they become authoritarian, but not strongly. And this is a text about what happens. So they put themselves as kings. I think it's like a third generation of king. So his great-grandfather was one of the Maccabees, but is the king named Yanai. And Yanai, or Jonathan in English, is the king. And so you have him, he's a Hasmonean king, and he's trying to make his way in the world. And this article here by Louis Ginsburg talks about some of his like goings on. Let me give you some brief broad strokes. Yanai, this Hasmonean king between Alexander the Great and the Romans at a time when they had autonomy and are trying to figure out what to do. They need to make political alliances. He makes political alliances with the Sadducees. Why does he make political alliances with the Sadducees? The Sadducees had a lot of money. The Sadducees, so they're Pharisees, Sadducees, and the Essenes. These are terms that people are familiar with? Yeah, okay. Sadducees have the money. He wants money. He also wants to wage war. Like any good king, he wants to kind of like, establish his kingship. So when he kind of like casts his lot with the Sadducees, it ticks off the Pharisees. The Pharisees are largely the ancestors, or no, they're not descendants. They're the ancestors. They come before the rabbis. Even we kind of called some of the Pharisees rabbis before. They're definitely the spiritual forefathers of rabbinic Judaism. So Shimon ben Shetach is one of them. So now you have a king who's definitely aligned with the Sadducees. And you have a pre-rabbinic but yet sage named Shimon ben Shetach, who is a Pharisee. Now to complicate so how do you think these two got along? Well or not well? Not well. Well, to complicate issues, guess what? The King Yanai's sister, King Yanai's wife rather, is the sister of Shimon ben Shetach. So the king, who's kind of aligned with the Sadducees, is married to the head Pharisee's sister. It sounds like an HBO show, right? We're ready for Game of Thrones, Game of Torah. So get ready for, and not only that, but there is lots of, so here there's a terrible incident that occurs that Yanai wants to show that he's the guy. And he wants to show his allegiance to the Sadducees. So what he does is, on the holiday of Sukkot, I showed you a video last year of a water libation ceremony that used to take place in the temple. They spritzed water all around. You throw a little water here, a little water there, sprinkling of water. They did a reenactment every year now in the old city. Well, the water, it's considered sacred. And you toss the water on the altar. But Yanai, what he does in this very serious ceremony, at this very serious time of year, he pours the water out at his feet in front of all of the Pharisees. And they go nuts because that was his declaration of allegiance to the Sadducees. It was very powerful. You know what the people then do? They start throwing their etrogs at him on Sukkot. They throw it at him. And he ends up, chaos ends up erupting, and the legend is that he killed 6,000 Pharisees. He then sends the Pharisees into exile, but then his wife convinces him to bring back her brother. We read a story last year of when the brothers brought back into the court. They don't have an easy relationship, nevertheless. That is Shimon ben Shetach, the Pharisee, with this king, Yanai, the Hasmonean king. The story that we're going to study today, any questions about anything I just said? The story that we're going to study today. So basically, you have a king who's a Hasmonean king in between the Greeks leaving and the Romans coming. And he is aligned with the Sadducees, who are not rabbinic. They are higher class. They are wealthy. They have different philosophies. He makes a statement, even though his brother-in-law is a Pharisee And the head Pharisee, instead of inviting him over for a Sunday barbecue, he throws the water on the ground in the biggest important ceremony. They have a riot. He kills a bunch of them. It's not a good situation. That's where we are. The sister intervenes. They kind of like have Shimon ben, what? There's an intervention, a family intervention. They go to therapy. They talk about their feelings. No, therapies, I'm making fun. Therapy is very important, so I'm not trying to diminish therapy. They go into therapy, and basically they still never get along, but they're able to coexist. So Shimon ben Shetach is operating, he's the Nasi, the head of the rabbinic establishment, the Sanhedrin, and the king, Yanai, is the head of the aristocracy. So there's a Cold War existence, or they're sort of reluctantly accepting each other. And then there's a ruling in the Talmud. The ruling in the Talmud is that I'm on page 5 now, that kings of Israel cannot stand in trial. They can't be tried. King of Israel can't be tried. Now, I want to be very clear here. A king of Israel. So I already think there's differences of like office, and I just want to make sure. It's a king. It's not a prime minister. We're not talking about presidents. We're not talking about, there isn't a democracy. Like, this is a king of Israel. But some of the emotions that come up will will feel familiar. So the Gemara asks a question. What's the reason? Why in the world does the Gemara state that a king of Israel can't stand trial? Why? What good reason? Now, usually in the Gemara, and you've started studying a little Gemara with me, also with Rabbi Alexander on every other Saturday afternoon, hint, advertisement, that if you learn a little Gemara, usually what happens is that the Gemara will ask a question about a ruling. How most often are rulings justified in the text? In the Gemara, how do the rulings get justified? The rabbis say you should or shouldn't do a certain thing. Where do they usually base that upon? The Torah, a proof text. Because, and it's not really ever a proof text, they have a reading of a text from which they extrapolate or they deduce a truth or an idea. They'll say, since the Torah says blah, 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 3 blahs, that means we have Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Because the Torah said blah, blah, blah 3 times, 3 holidays. That's an example of the rabbis give meaning to every word of the Torah. This is a Rabbi Akiva kind of thing. So most often, if you are a Talmudist and you're looking for a reason to a ruling, the ruling is going to be couched in some sort of source hermeneutic from a text. Not here. There's another way that you can often get ruling, less popular but still pretty prominent. Logic. The rabbis will say the ruling logically should be so, and then give you or sort of play out a logical game where at the end of the day you end up with the ruling and it makes sense logically why that ruling should be. Either a source that has like some sort of extrapolated truth from it, or logic, most often determine what the law is. That's in the Talmud. Not here. In here, much less frequently, a story is told that informs why the law took shape the way it does. And so now we're going to tell the story of what happened with Yanai and Shimon ben Shetach that determined that a king, a ruling king, can't stand under trial. Any questions? Good. The Gemara asks, I'm at the top of page 5 for all of you at home, but what is the reason that others do not judge the king of Israel? Again, that's the question. Why don't kings stand trial? We're on the third line, the third word from the end of the line. It is because of an incident that happened. As the slave of Yanai the king killed a person. So kings have lots of servants. Yanai has servants. Word gets out that one of Yanai's servants, or a slave, we don't like using the word slave, and there it's still a slave, and I'll tell you why. He kills someone. Shimon ben Shetach said to the sages, "Put your eyes on him and let us judge him. We got to bring this guy to justice." This slave, even though he's part of the court, this guy's got to stand trial. He killed somebody. Shimon ben Shetach, by the way, he was a big advocate of trial law, especially with capital punishment in the Gemara. Like, he's a big, and of the rules of capital cases, he was a stickler for detail. So much so, when the case doesn't conform, like, even when it's clear that someone killed someone, when it becomes illegal the way that they were adjudicating the matter, he would always side with the proper adjudication over the result. He really wanted things done the proper way. So he says, look, we got to judge this slave. They sent word to Yanai. So they send the messenger, they send Yanai an email, and they say, Yanai, your slave killed a person. Yanai, you've got mail. Yanai opens the email. He says, Oy vey. Yanai sent the slave to them. Think about that in terms of power. What could have Yanai said at that point?
He's under my protection.
Exactly. My slave, my problem. My jurisdiction. So already there's this, you see that they're doing business with one another. The king has a court or has servants, and the king recognizes some power of the court. How far that power extends is not clear, but he opens the email, and then he sends his slave, the suspect, to be tried. So there's a recognition of some sort of judicial authority that the rabbis, the Pharisees, have. They sent word to Yanai, you also come here. Why? They want Yanai to come too. They want Yanai to stand trial. He sends them the slave. They say it's not enough. You have to stand trial. Why? And then the question is, why would he have to stand trial? And so here's the proof text. As the verse states, with regard to an ox that gored a person to death, he should be testified against with his owner. And that's a pasuk. It's a pasuk from Exodus 21:29. What's the logic there?
That you're responsible for your animals.
You're responsible, right?
For your slave.
Right. You in the Torah are responsible. It's called shur hamued, which means a goring animal, right? That if you have a goring ox, and you're responsible for that ox, just like, what's that? That's right. Right, a dog who attacked a child, or you have a leash law, right? Or if you have does anyone here have a farm? No. Okay, we're in the valley. In Palos Verdes, they had like at least a 10% chance. Not really, but like a little bit more land. But like, I imagine that in townships where there are farms, that there is also rules and laws about fencing and proper containment, and that if your animal does something, you're responsible. God forbid if your dog attacked a child or any person, you're walking on. I mean, I hate when I see people, the neighbors, the dog's off the leash. Oh, don't worry, he's a friendly dog. Oh, okay, so you have right to decide the law based on your hypothesis that your animal is above the law because it is a friendly dog. Oh, okay. I hate that. The law is the leash. Put your dog on the leash. And so there is in the Torah a sense of accountability. You as an owner are responsible for your property. If your ox gored somebody, you as the owner are liable, and you also have to stand trial. The tort of liability. Good. Ooh, Gary, nice. Woo-hoo, fancy. Woo. Okay. So he gives him a pasuk. They sent to Yanai, you should come because it says in the Torah, he should be testified against with his owner. And the rabbis extrapolate. The Torah stated, the owner of the ox should come and stand over his ox. Now, if you were Yanai and you get this email, could you argue with that logic? Yes. And why? Go ahead, Joette. Oh, sorry. I'll repeat Joette's. Oh, we have two mics. Go ahead. In the mic, or I'll repeat it. Go ahead.
Okay, because with the ox, you cannot reason with the ox. You cannot talk to the ox. The ox cannot defend itself. But with a slave, with a person, he has a mind of his own, and he made a decision to kill somebody, and it wasn't the king's decision. And even though the owner of the ox can say, it wasn't my decision, the owner of the ox should be aware of the ox's tendencies. And since you cannot bring an ox to trial, you bring the owner to trial.
Excellent. Yanai could have sent the email back and said, dear Pharisees, you guys are nuts. You read the Torah a little too... an ox is not proof text for a person. And don't think because an ox, the owner of the ox needs to stand trial for the damages of the ox, that I need to stand trial for what a servant did. The servant has agency over their own actions. The servant could speak. The servant can do all these, in so many ways, in innumerable ways. A slave is different than, I'm sorry, I'm buzzing here, is different than an ox. So don't tell me that, I'm not standing trial. I gave you the slave. That's enough. Dayenu. Sei gesund, say hello to the wife and kids. Sincerely, Yanai, send. But he doesn't do that. Yanai says, Yanai came and sat down. He goes to the court. He concedes, so there's even now a further display of acceptance of authority. So he sits down. So far it's looking pretty good for Yanai, right? I mean, at least in my opinion. You can tell me if you disagree. They send him an email, not looking good. It's looking like he's made two gestures that show acceptance of rabbinic jurisdiction over his slave. And then, in my mind, what's like a piss poor, can we say that? That's not proper. Like a really bad logical inference, a logical proof text, he accepts. as a demonstration of his need to sit trial. So he goes and he sits trial. I am at the end of where it says Shimon ben Shetach. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 lines from the bottom in the middle of the line on page 5. Shimon ben Shetach said to him, his brother-in-law, who's the head of the rabbinical court, says to him, Yanai the king, stand on your feet and witnesses will testify against you. And it is not before us that you are standing to give us honor, but it is before the Holy One who spoke and the world came into being that you are standing. As it is stated, then both the people between whom the controversy is shall stand before the Lord, before whom the priests and the judges shall be in those days. So Yanai, what Shimon ben Shetach says, on your feet, stand up. You stand during the trial. Was that nice of Shimon ben Shetach or not? No. Who wants to tell me why it wasn't nice? Go ahead.
It may not have been nice or politically correct, but it was the right thing to do. So we have here a moral dilemma.
Good.
Do you want to be politically correct or subservient to the king, or stand for the right action to be taken?
So it's sort of like a tough place to be, because he's the head of a different branch of government, and he's brought, and he comes to, and then they make him stand like a, and so the question is that proper or not? In other words, should have they said, okay, you came here to you came here to stand trial, but just sit down, you're the king. Don't stand like like the other guys would. Sit down, you're the king. But Shimon ben Shetach, you remember, who's a stickler for the procedure, says, stand up. Everyone stands up in this court if they're a defendant. You stand up. So it's a good question. The question is, does he degrade him? Does he make him conform to the law like everyone else? Is the conforming to the law a degradation? Would it have been the worst thing if he told him to sit down? You're at the trial. You're already here. It's not clear. What's actually very, so it's it's a good comment. But clearly, Yanai feels degraded because Yanai had been cooperative up to this point. Hold on one second, Zissel. Yanai had been cooperative. They asked for the slave to stand trial. He says, no problem, sends the slave. Then they give this kind of crummy reason for him to stand trial, and he shows up and he stands trial. But then they make him stand in the trial, and he basically says, enough is enough. And look what happened. Do you want to ask a question before we go on? Okay, so we're going to get to what he does in a second. So go ahead, make your comment. So now, what is? They just yelled at him, and they said, Yanai, on your feet. And we're going to go to a commercial, a comment sponsored by Zissel. The cliffhanger. What's Yanai going to say?
Well, I think this is a very early example and a perfect example of the adage, everyone is equal under the law.
For sure, Shimon ben Shetach thinks that. Maybe even Yanai thinks that because he came to sit. That's why I'm going to say, he acknowledges the authority of the court. He comes. He agrees to stand trial. He'd already killed 6,000 of them a few years ago. Like, if he wanted to cry foul, He could have cried foul. He could have said, take your request from my slave and stick it. Or then he says, all right, I don't care what happens to the slave. Sends the slave off, but then they follow up and they send a second email, which is, you are responsible too. He could have said, stick it. But he doesn't. Now, whether he did that because of true recognition of authority, or was there a political element? Was he trying to placate them? Did he realize that his rule wasn't firm? No, we don't know. Did he need them? Was his wife upset? None of this is read into the text, and we can kind of like imagine a lot of different ways that this is constructed. But he came. Then Shimon ben Shetach says, everyone stands up, so will you. Yanai the king, so I'm on line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, line 6 of page 6 in the middle of the line. I will not, Yanai the king said to him, I will not stand when you alone say this to me, but according to what your colleagues say. Yanai says, enough of this. Let's call what this really is, my good friend Shimon ben Shetach, oh brother-in-law of mine. This is nuts. You're calling me out here. You're dragging me into court, not because you're a stickler for everyone's the same under the law, justice, tzedek, tirdof. It's a bunch of nonsense. This is a personal attack against me. You're out to get me. You don't like that I'm married to your sister. You don't like that I sent you out. You don't like that I killed 6,000 Pharisees. You don't like a lot. We have a complicated relationship. Really, this is not about the slave and the murder. This is about you and me. It's personal. So that's what he says. And then he says, oh, really? You're telling me this. You're telling me to stand up. What about the rest of you rabbis? What do you guys think? Do you agree with him? Do you agree with Shimon ben Shetach? Do you think I should stand up for this kangaroo court? I read that into it. And this is where it gets really crazy. By the way, it says Shimon ben Shetach turned to his right. The Gemara, it's not clear if it's Shimon ben Shetach who turned to his right or whether Yanai turned to his right, but I don't think it matters. We'll play with it and see if it matters. So Shimon ben Shetach turned to his right. He was just put on the spot. So Shimon ben Shetach, he's the head of the rabbi court. Okay, associate justices, support me. He turns to his right. The judges force their faces to the ground. Shimon ben Shetach, Yanai says, I will not stand for this personal attack. This isn't about the law. This is about us. Other justices, you tell me whether I should stand or not. And so Shimon ben Shetach looks over and goes to his colleagues, "No." He turns to his right, and they put their faces to the ground. They hide. He turned to his left. No. And they put their faces to the ground. And they say nothing. Shimon ben Shetach then said to them, get ready, this is where the text gets crazy. You are masters of thoughts, enjoying your private thoughts and not speaking. May the master of thoughts, God, come and punish you. Immediately, the angel Gabriel came and struck down those judges to the ground, and they died. Shimon ben Shetach says, the king says, associate judges, speak up. This guy, Shimon ben Shetach, brother-in-law of mine, he's out to get me. What do you guys think? And no one says a word. They're intimidated. They're scared. We're not sure. And who are they intimidated by? Okay, they're intimidated by the king. They're intimidated by power. And so, Shimon ben Shetach is like, oh my gosh, you guys, like, you're thinking it, but you're not saying it? Okay. Let the master of thought then get you. And that's what happened. And they're dead. And what's interesting here is that the like, Yanai, it's like this up and down that I think is intentional in the text. I just want to point this out for a second. Yanai comes and sits down in the court, and Shimon ben Shetach says to him, stand up. And then the judges are asked a question, and they look down to avert Yanai. And when they don't look up, but rather look down, then they are struck down. So I think there's a play here on up and down, right? Like Shimon ben Shetach sits down, he's told to stand up, the judges look down, and then they are struck down. There's a down-up thing going on here, just in terms of like literary comments. At that moment, when they saw that the Sanhedrin does not have the power to force the king to heed its instructions, the sages said, a king does not judge others, and others do not judge him, and he does not testify, and others do not testify concerning him. And that's the end of the story.
I don't follow that logic.
Okay. So Joette says, that wasn't a question. Was it a question or it was an objection, not a question, I think. Okay, right, but I don't think, so it's not, Joette wasn't asking me to clarify the logic. I think you were disagreeing with the logic.
Yeah,
Right, okay.
It doesn't,
You don't, right, it doesn't,
it doesn't seem to follow from the action to the conclusion.
okay. So here, let's get a clarification. Why do the rabbis deduce this? Again, remember, that was the question that we started with. It's a very Talmudic way. We had a question, we went on a meandering story, and then we got back to the question. And the question is, how come they made this ruling that kings don't have to sit down, or can't get tried? And we taught this is usually you get a proof text. Here we don't have a proof text. But then at the end of this story, they deduce no more. And Joette says, I disagree with the logic. Bridget. That's not okay. Thank you for asking. Thank you for pointing that out, Bridget. It's not. That's commentary. The bold-faced are the literal words of the Talmud, and the non-bolded are like they've added that in. I think that's reading it. I think that's interpretive, not just explanatory. The Talmud doesn't say why. I think commentators say that that's the reason, but the Talmud kind of leaves it up. They're just like, that happened, and therefore we don't. So why do you think that they said, is it the power of the king? Like, why ultimately, according to this text, aren't kings? Do you think that kings don't stand trial in the Jewish court of law? Because if Shimon ben Shetach is the only one who could stand down and look into the king's eyes and say, stand up and stand trial, I think you have business. And he's got sort of like a personal, axe to grind. No one else had the conviction, the courage, did I say courage? To stand up. Even if it was right, no one did it. The court failed. The only person who was able to yell for justice, you could question his motivation. Everyone else disappeared. So maybe this story is a story that shows it's not that the king is above the law, it's just that the law can't hold the king. That it's unreasonable I'll get to your point in a second, Joette. If the contemporaries of Shimon ben Shetach, wouldn't stand up and do what's right, how can we ask anyone in any subsequent court? We already have a proof that it's never going to work. The court system it's not going to contain the king. No rabbi is going to look in the king's eyes. The only rabbi who looked in the king's eyes and said, "On your feet, witness," was his brother-in-law who didn't like him. Had an axe to grind. Joette.
But I think that
I'll repeat it.
I think that the other rabbis who got knocked off by Gabriel, so they were wrong not to speak up.
It could be that the text is reading that.
Because it says, may God come and punish you, and God does. So God thinks that those rabbis were wrong.
So Joette's making a good point. Joette says, wait a second, it's not, the rabbis are, God punishes these rabbis. They get killed. They pay with their lives. And because of that, doesn't that show that the king, I'm extrapolating what you're saying, you didn't say this, but doesn't that show that the king should stand trial? And you could say, yes. But maybe it's a recognition, not what should happen, but what could happen. In other words, in the ideal world, is this text teaching? I'm asking a question. The king should be able to stand trial. But this example shows that the court system was not up to it. It couldn't handle it. It broke. And what the justices did was ultimately wrong, and therefore they died. Maybe it's the death of the whole court system, that they showed it ain't going to work. And therefore, from this, they don't want to stress the legal system anymore, saying putting the king to trial, even though he should stand trial, just simply won't work. Okay, Rosie.
Yeah, I have some comments to make. I'm just wondering if, first of all, I think it was a frivolous situation that would bring the king to trial. And I'm just wondering, in future kingships, whether or not this was relevant to kings being at a higher level and not subject to trial. But does not take away the fact that kings were killed and without a trial. I'm thinking of historically, like in Russia with Nicholas, and even with Charles I in England, when regicide, and even during the revolution in France. So I'm just wondering, when the guillotine, of course, killed a lot of people, including the king and the queen. So I wonder if the trial situation, there were no trials, they were just killed. So at least in Judaism, we have a process, it seems like, even though it was frivolous, that brought the king to trial, which was not really relevant. So I know I'm going round and around here. But I'm just wondering if in future kingships that we're familiar with in history, that maybe there was some relevance to what we just read.
I would have to do a little research, but I will say the relationship between the Hasmoneans and the rabbis gets worse, or never really. How about that? Doesn't get worse. That's a bad answer. The relationship between the Hasmoneans and the Pharisees is often not good. Whether it gets worse than this, or if this is the nadir, or I don't know. And then the question is, were other kings put? I don't think that the rabbis tried to put any king to trial. And then after this, then of course the kings become, puppets of the Romans. That's the Herods, right? Like they're put into power, and then they're just answering to the Caesar. So, but then there's conflict there. And the question is, Rosalie, that's a good question. Was it frivolous? For sure, Shimon ben Shetach seems like he has a personal stake in this, but he's also a guy who was really a stickler for the letter of the law. And maybe the letter of the law should be that the king should stand trial. Like, yeah, he doesn't like Yanai, but he's going about it. And then Rosalie makes a good point. Like, he's a guy, by the way, there's a story told of Shimon ben Shetach. I hope I'm getting all the details right in the Gemara, where he sees two men go into a city of ruins, like a kind of a ruined, collapsed buildings or whatnot. One man chasing the other. Now, let me just put in parentheses. According to rabbinic law, for capital punishment to be exacted, you need witnesses who see the same thing and pass testimony in the same way that they saw the murder occur. That's a parenthetical comment. In order for it to be a capital case.
And they have to have had a warning not to do.
Yeah, there has to be a hatra'ah for it. So anyway, there's a very specific formula. So Shimon ben Shetach sees a guy running after another guy with a knife in his hand, and they run into a ruin. A few minutes later, the guy who was running from the guy with the knife is dead, and the guy who was chasing him with the knife holds the knife with blood on it. Guess what Shimon ben Shetach said? He said, no capital trial, no witnesses. I saw them go into the ruin. I didn't see him do it. I'm not a witness. There's no capital punishment here. Right. So he's a stickler for the law. And so maybe is this case trying to tell us he's such a stickler for the law that he brings the king in because that's the law. And that should be the law, but the law can't handle it. Or maybe it's a statement that, no, it shouldn't be the law. I don't know. It's a good question. So go ahead, Sissel. Did anyone else want, because Sissel's had, anyone else had something? Did I see another hand? Go ahead.
Well, just summarizing the whole thing, it's very interesting at the end, the summary, due to the danger of the Mara. This is, in my opinion, simply communal cowardice, because the community does not wish to take action against the ruler. Well, when that happens, then we have tyranny. If the community lacks the courage to stand up and fight in whichever way is possible, we have tyranny.
So it's interesting because that's a very sound argument to make, but it's almost like that argument would compel you then to say you absolutely must put a king on trial.
Yes, if the king or ruler acts against the law.
Right.
Because that ruler, the tyrannical ruler, establishes his or her own rules, and that does not bode well for the community.
That's right. For sure it doesn't. And so much so that Gabriel is summoned and these guys get smited because they neglected their responsibility, which was to be the judges. They're getting paid to sit in that seat. It's a tough job, but that's the job that you have. So But then on the other hand, then their ruling is sort of interesting. The ruling then is no, the king doesn't sit trial.
Because of the danger of the matter, that tells me the whole story. Communal cowardice.
So according to Zissel, it's communal cowardice. Okay, we're going to stop in just a moment. Did anyone else have any thoughts, comments, opinions? Bridget, go ahead. That's actually really an interesting point, Bridget, that you shouldn't have a king. That's a great point. I kind of think, first of all, it's really interesting because they didn't really think Yanai was like the right kind of king. Because the only king over Israel is supposed to be from the Davidic line. So it was almost like they tolerated Yanai because he was and any Hasmonean king, because they were realities, but not because they thought they were legitimate. Right? They didn't. If you had asked them, like, "Shh, tell me you think this guy is like the real deal," no, he's not a descendant of King David. Like if we look at Jewish messianism, Mashiach means anointed one. It doesn't mean son of God. Mashiach means anointed one. It's an anointing ceremony for a monarch. And in our tradition, the monarch needs to be from a descendant of David. But is this, and Bridget's saying, is this an anti-monarchical text? Or is it an anti-illegitimate monarchy text? Or is it an anti-society text? Or an anti-court text? Or all of the above, or some combination of any of those? I don't know. It's a really provocative text. That's what I do know.
I think that the Tanakh is anti-monarchy.
Yeah, the Tanakh is anti-monarchy, but will tolerate it. For sure, the Bible is like, so Joette makes a point. It's clear that the Bible, like God in the Bible is like, ugh, I can't believe you guys want a king. After all I've done for you. And the only reason you want a king, it's like my kids, they all want these stupid sneakers that the other kids are wearing. Why do they want these stupid sneakers? Because the other kids are wearing them. So the Israelites fall prey of the same thing. It's like they got God in their corner, but it's not enough. No, the Canaanites and the Philistines, they all have a king. We want a king too. And so then they get him. So finally God's like, it's like me with the sneakers. Fine. And buy these stupid overpriced sneakers that they wear for 3 months and they get muddy outside and they ruin them and it's a lot of money and endorsed by some guy who could put a ball through a hoop and who cares. Right? Like I'd rather have like the Gary Pachersky nice guy sneaker. That's a sneaker I can get behind. But like, Michael Jordan, who cares? But anyway, so the Tanakh is for sure reluctantly acceptance of the Davidic monarchy. For all the King David, for all of that, that's only a reluctant acceptance. So ideal, no monarchy. Tolerated Davidic monarchy. But Yanai and the Hasmoneans, what a bunch of clowns. But clowns with swords, so we got to tolerate them. Or clowns who say, oh, do any of you agree with Shimon ben Shetach? Makes all the rabbis go like this. And therefore he could break the judicial system. Okay. Go ahead, Zissel.
We have an example of a prophet that was against the tyranny of a king. Back in Genesis, when the children of Israel demanded Saul to be a king, Samuel did not want to. That's right. He wound up doing it because of pressure. Right. However, he did not want to because he was a very wise or very prophetic prophet. That's right. And he did not want to put all that power on one man. That's why he did not want to make Saul anoint Saul as king of Israel.
That's right. So, yeah, I mean, it's clear that the Bible prefers no king. And in the laws of Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy, which is the fifth of the 5 books of the Torah, was written after already the fall of the monarchy. So it was written after, and then it's presented now as part of the Torah as before the monarchy, but it was written really after that period. They put in the books of Deuteronomy laws about the king, but that was already written after we had already accepted a king. It's very clear in the Torah and in the Tanakh, and like for prophets like Shmuel, king is not okay. And then the only one who was able to stand up to the king is the prophet, and only in certain situations. Because you had, like, Samuel was able to stand up to Saul, and Samuel was able to stand up for other prophets, like, were able to stand up to King David. But, like, Elijah wasn't able to stand up to Jezebel. He ran away. So there is, like, this, and then the rabbis weren't able to stand up to Yanai. Nathan stood up to David that's Tachanun. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this study, and it's certainly an interesting and challenging text considering everything that's going on. So I hope everyone enjoyed the study. Thank you. I just want to let everyone know of upcoming programs. Something you're all going to want to come to, and if any of you need a ride, we can help you with that. Not in two Shabbats time, so the fourth Friday of the month, we're starting a program called Fourth Fridays. It is a program, it's services for an hour, and then dinner and a program. And so this coming Fourth Friday is going to be with Joanna Mendelson, who used to work at the ADL, and she now works for Jewish Federation, but she is a leading expert on the rise of anti-Semitism. So she'll be our guest speaker on the fourth Friday. So it's January 27th. You come for Shabbat services, 6 o'clock, dinner at 7 o'clock, and then Joanna will talk to us about the rise of anti-Semitism. If for some of you it's late and it's harder to drive, let me know if you'd like to come, and we'll arrange someone to come get you.
Joanna spoke to us pre-COVID an evening on Friday night, Shabbat, and she was superb.
Gary Pechersky says 2 thumbs up. Yeah, she's great. She's great. She's been on MSNBC. She's really great. Yeah, good. Okay, everyone have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Rabbi, do we have any more of those shine a light signs? Okay. No, because Ray was at my house and she saw my sign in the yard and she said, "Oh, I like that." And I said, "Well, I got it at a .rl." She said, "I'd like one too."
She just has to email Joanna. It's Joanna's program.
Thank you.
Active Federation.
Oh, you mean to get more sent over to a .rl? Yeah. Got it.
We won't be here next week because we're being requested to be in Atlanta with our daughter. You know what? They tolerated us when we were raising them. You tolerated them. Oh, and the beautiful thing is we all get along now.
Thanks.
We're still fighting. We're still fighting this on the same level in a democracy. That's right. Whether it's Israel or the United States.
It's still an issue. That's right. You're absolutely right. That's why it's a really interesting.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks, Esther. he shows up. They say, no, you're the owner, you have to come. But then when they say to him, you have to stand there, he says, I'll sit, but you're not making me stand like an idiot. So I don't know if it's relate to what I said. No, I think it's the same question. I think it's a good question. It's like when does the liability